For several years, I've been pleased to recommend two magazines to our people to subscribe to. And those are Media Bypass and Nexus magazine. And a number of you I know are subscribing and are picking them up at the stores. We are honored now that Duncan Rhodes, the publisher of Nexus magazine, saw fit to come to attend Global Sciences this time from Australia, which is a fur piece, and it's a real long swim, as you know. But we're real pleased that he's with us and has been willing to share with us some of the things that anything he wants to tell us. I've told him you could put Global Sciences on the front of that magazine and it would fit perfectly with what we endeavor to share with other people as far as the truth is concerned. And what I'd like to ask him to do, if he's willing, and he said he is, to tell a few things that even he cannot print. Would you like to hear some of those things? Okay. You see, this crowd knows no limits. They're a raucous bunch. Anyway, I want you to know you're among friends, but I would still recommend a moving target as much as possible. Give Duncan Rhodes a big round of United States welcome, please.
Thank you. Can everyone hear at the back? No one's answering. I assume that you can hear down the back. Just yell or wave if you can't. Kathy's right. Thank you. Well, first up, I'd like to thank Dean and Phyllis and the gang for inviting me to speak here at the conference, at the Congress. I've got to confess that Dean and I must have a mutual admiration thing happening across the oceans of the world. What I'll do is I'll just recap how I got into Nexus magazine and a bit of the background so you can get a feel for where I'm coming from, what I'm doing. You can make up your own minds as to whether I'm a CIA agent, like I've been told is the bit of the rumour in America at the moment. I wish I was, I tell you. I would have to get up so early. Right, my background is I was born in England in 1961 and I came from a typical middle-class family living in the country areas, farming background. We emigrated due to a family feud when I was about the age of 3.5, and we emigrated as far away from our family as we could possibly go. We went to Australia, not just the sunny part of Australia, we went to a little tiny island state right at the bottom of Australia. It's a triangular state called the state of Tasmania. And it is literally the other side of the world from Great Britain where we left. My parents promptly got themselves into debt like all good families do these days. We bought a nice farm in the middle of nowhere, surrounded on 3 sides by totally wild forest and bush in a little township called Lilydale. Lilydale was so small, didn't have a pub, which is pretty unusual for Australia, I tell you. So I grew up in the country area of Tasmania. I lived there from 3.5 to about 13 or 14 years of age. I went to the local primary school, and I've got to confess, looking back on my life, that I felt a little different from the rest of the locals at school. Tasmania also has a lot of jokes floating around Australia. I don't know whether you have similar jokes in America referring to certain states where a lot of inbreeding goes on. If you go to the mainland of Australia and you say you're from Tasmania, you get the jokes. And so I always stipulate I was not born in Tasmania, I was born in Great Britain. To cut a long story short, everything we turned our attention to on this farm in Tasmania failed. The dairy industry, as soon as we got into it, the market bottom fell out. Beef industry. So in the end, we basically just covered enough money to pay off the interest on our overdraft. It was tough going. On the other hand, my parents and myself and my younger brothers and sisters. We made the best of an interesting situation. We killed and cured our own meat, tanned our own hides, raised chickens. We used to get about 55 black Australorp chooks and put them in the farmyard for a year, and then one day of the year we'd come along and slaughter the lot, put them in our freezer and have a chicken every Sunday lunch. A few years before we left Tasmania, my father and mother went through what a lot of people here probably have gone. They sort of looked at the world one day and thought, what's it all about? They started their spiritual quest. I was about 13 or 14 years of age, and I was very fascinated by this sudden change in my parents. They started meditating, started reading books by people like Lobsang Rampa, which talked about conspiracies, hollow earth. Anyone here heard of Lobsang Rampa? Was he a big guy in the States? You know what I'm talking about. After Lobsang Rampa, via lots of coincidences and weird and wonderful things, we progressed to Rudolf Steiner. Eventually we got into Findhorn. Anyone here heard of Findhorn community in northern Scotland? That's what I like to see. It's an intentional community in northern Scotland. One of the main things about Findhorn that fascinated our family was their relationship with the natural kingdom. The ability to communicate to plants and animals, grow 40-pound cabbages and the like. That really captivated us. So we became aware that the natural kingdom is alive and well and intelligent. And this may follow on from Alona's talk a little bit in terms of communicating with nature. I'll just digress and give you an example of how weird my parents got. We decided to make a deal after we heard from Findhorn community that, morning Alec, that you can have a working relationship with the natural kingdom. We made a deal with the snake kingdom. In Tasmania, like the rest of Australia, we've got lots of snakes and they're all poisonous. And being a typical Aussie, as soon as you see a snake, you kill it. That's the logic, thinking you're doing a good thing for society. It's not that way at the moment because there's a lot more awareness of environmental and native wildlife in Australia. But in those days, you saw a snake, you killed it, and you didn't think anything about it. And incidentally, that's where most people get bitten by snakes too. So we made a deal. Basically, my father went up to the top of the creek valley and he said to the snake kingdom, all right, we won't kill any more snakes as long as you don't kill any more cattle. And you know, it worked. He also put in a sub-clause basically asking the snakes not to come in the house or around the backyard, which was also adhered to. We didn't kill any more snakes, they didn't kill any more cattle, and that basic deal held into effect for the next few years before we left the place. After this was going, we noticed a few other things were happening. About a year before, our cattle dogs had decided they'd had enough of our farm and their weird owners, and they just took off, disappeared, either fought each other to death or ran off into the hills and were never seen again. So my brothers and myself and my sister became the cattle dogs, which got me very fit. It's probably why I'm built for speed and in these days. But it meant when you're chasing a herd of cattle over 450 acres in Tasmania, the hills go like this. They're so steep that not even many people bother with horses. You know, maybe you have a motorbike to run around. What we noticed was, and we were meditating at this stage, we'd gone vegetarian, so we had a freezer full of meat we didn't want. What we noticed was that on the days that we wanted to move one of the herds of cattle from this pasture, a couple of miles away to this pasture here, normally what would happen is you'd get up, you'd go there, and you'd spend half the day rounding up this herd to get them through the gate, funneling through over to here. What we noticed is if we visualised in the evening before what we wanted to do with that herd, they would all be sitting there or standing there at the gate waiting to be herded through. We would save half a day of running around. So on a practical level, I started to realise that my parents weren't so weird after all. There was something to this. It saved me a lot of running around. And so you can probably get the rest of the picture. One other little deal that my father made was also, I was talking about this to a couple of the speakers at dinner last night. We made a deal with the wallaby kingdom. How many people know what a wallaby is? It's like a small chopped down version of a kangaroo. Basically they eat grass. Farmers' logic is if wallabies eat grass, cattle can't eat grass, therefore you're losing money. Of course, if you read the books, wallabies and rabbits eat a different type of grass from the cattle, so there's room for both. But we weren't quite that smart yet. So we had been letting groups of hunters go up in the early evening at dusk and dawn and let them go shooting wallabies and taking the carcasses. We figured there was more than enough wallabies in the forest. When we made this relationship with the natural kingdom, we decided, well, maybe this isn't a very nice thing to do. And so one night the hunters came up and we thought, oh, we've got this deal going with the snake kingdom and we're horribly vegetarian. Maybe we shouldn't let these guys go hunting up there. So we politely said, no, we're not doing hunting up there anymore. And so at that point in time, we truly became known as the mad English family up on the hill. Interesting footnote to this story, we sold the property. We wrote to Findhorn Community, this was in the mid-1970s, and we said, we love you guys so much, we want to donate our farm to you people so you can set up a Findhorn in Australia. That was our dream and vision. And they wrote back a very nice letter saying, well, that's very kind of you, but we have a lot on our plate at the moment and we can't take up your offer. But if you want to start up a Findhorn community in Australia, you have our blessing. And eventually we did, but that's another story. So we put the farm on the market, advertised it in the papers in Sydney and Melbourne and the other big cities, and very shortly we sold it. We paid off our debt and our overdraft, and we decided to buy a little sort of camper van and trailer and tent, and our family hit the road for a year in search of a dream. We had no home to go back to. We had a dwindling supply of funds in the bank account. And we set off for about a year travelling around Australia like a pack of gypsies. But we had this vision. We had this vision that we wanted to set up an intentional community in an appropriate spot in Australia, and that the right people and the right things would materialise at the right time. Well, this is how Findhorn worked in all the books, see? So we went around Australia. About a week or two after we had left our property, we started getting some newspaper clippings from the local papers in Lilydale, Tasmania. Some of our friends had passed on some papers, and the headlines read things like, "Nature goes wild in small Tasmanian farm." And the gist of the story that I can put together is that the new owner of our property had bought the land on spec through the newspapers. He was a butcher by trade, and he wanted to get out of the rat race and live somewhere quiet and peaceful. So Tasmania was his goal. He bought the property. There was about 3 or 4 days lapsed after we had left before he moved onto the property. So, and plus, we didn't really think to tell a butcher about our deal with the natural kingdom. I mean, we were already considered weird enough in what we were doing that we thought, well, we don't want to jeopardise this sale. He might think we're a real bunch of losers. So we didn't tell him about the deal with the natural kingdom. In fact, we didn't really think about it much more after that. But what happened was, the story that we were told was something like this. The new owner went on his inspection tour of the property, got on the back of the Land Rover and drove around the bushes, etc. Now, the specifics of the deal with the wallaby was that the wallaby kingdom was that we won't shoot the wallabies as long as they stick to the grass on the outside of the paddocks. The grass on the outside of the paddocks it's full of twigs and branches and stuff. It prickles the cow's nose. They don't want to eat that grass anyway, so we allowed room for 2. So the new owner, he goes up to the top paddocks and he sees these wallabies all eating around the outside of the paddock in the middle of the day, which is a bad sign as far as he and the hunters are concerned. It means that there's lots of them. And he thought, wow, there's got a lot of wallabies on this property here, and they're just as bold as anything in the middle of the day. A few evenings later, the hunters came up to his property and said, "Oh, we used to go hunting on Mr. Rhodes' property up there. Do you mind if we go up there again now?" And he said, "Sure, there's heaps of them." And the short of the story is this: the more wallabies they killed, the more came out of the bush. And it got to the stage where they didn't even bother taking the carcasses away. There was just like plague proportion wallabies all over the paddock. And then the Tasmanian devils came out. Now, Tasmanian devils, you've probably seen the Warner Brothers or Disney cartoon where the Tasmanian devil is this really fierce critter that spins into a whirlwind and destroys everything. They're not quite like that in real life, although they are very fierce when cornered. They usually come out at night. They're pretty solitary creatures. But in this particular case, they were coming out in the daylight. They were forming packs. They were eating the carcasses. They were getting very bold and brave and visiting neighbouring farms and attacking sheep and lambs. And scientists were coming from all over the country to observe this amazing phenomena on this property, Tasmanian devils in the daytime. So it gives you an idea of our responsibility interacting with the natural kingdom is far greater than we perceive. And for those who want to try, and we had some media attention by this stage. My father had started writing books on organic agriculture and became a personality in the organic gardening and farming movement in Australia. So we had switched organic, and he was becoming high profile, and he used to talk about some of this stuff on the local radio station, and people would try it and ring in on talkback and experience remarkable results. That's something I want to just leave you with before I really get off on a tangent from what I wanted to talk to you about. Back to my background. So we went around Australia, we set up an intentional community. It was called Homeland Community. This was in 1977. We had very idealistic goals and aims. We were very proud of the fact we didn't have a leader, but we had a core group of people. So I spent a couple of very exciting teenage years on this intentional community, finished high school, and in my last year of high school, when I was really into mathematics, this guy came to the community who had been told by his higher self he had to come to the community because he had a book that was meant to be taken to our community. So the book went to all the sort of leaders of the community who weren't leaders, and they read it. It didn't make any sense to them, and then it fell into my lap, and it just blew my mind. And that book is probably the reason that I'm standing here today in front of you. It was a book written by a gentleman called Captain Bruce Cathy. Anyone here heard of Bruce Cathy's books? Good, I won't go into too much detail. The gist of the book was this. It was his third book, Harmonic 288. Bruce Cathy was a New Zealand airline pilot in the commercial airlines. He witnessed during the 50s and 60s many stunning cases of UFOs in flight. He would speak to radar and ground controllers, and they would confirm that they'd shut up on radar. And when he started wanting to talk to the public, his bosses and basically said to him, "You talk about this and you're out of a job. That's just the deal. We all know they're there. The Air Force knows more about them than we do. The government and sections of the government know more about them than we do, but that's all we're doing. If you want to stay flying, don't talk about flying saucers." And he rebelled against this, and he started doing his own research. And one of the things he became very famous for was he got a map of New Zealand on the wall one day, and he put these nice coloured pins in the map on spots where very clear, unidentified sightings had occurred. Looking at the map one day, he saw that the most astounding sightings of all fell in straight, equidistant lines running vertically and horizontally across New Zealand. And so he started to think, well, maybe there's grounds to consider that there's a type of grid system that the UFOs either use for propulsion, or maybe they are putting into place for some future agenda. The grid system at that stage was also being explored in Europe with ley lines. David Hatchett-Childress's book Anti-Gravity in the World Grid and other books like that started appearing shortly afterwards. And now in the New Age movement in Australia, energy grids are all the rave. You can buy a software program which will give you printouts, etc. Bruce Cathy's grid, though, I must point out, isn't a clearly defined grid in the sense that you can stake it out and march along the world. His grid system involved a lot of mathematics. What he found was that the spacing between the lines of force or the lines of energy that were available, if you measured the distance between them, that distance was an exact proportional relationship of the whole circumference of the Earth at that latitude. Okay, so Earth being a little bit pear-shaped means that you're going to have slightly differing distance between the grid in the northern hemisphere up near the Arctic compared with down in New Zealand. So initially the physical distance in terms of our miles really threw him. He couldn't find any common relationship around the world on it until he broke down that distance as a proportion of the circumference, and he found that that relationship stayed constant. Now, I only mention that because a lot of people who read Bruce Cathy's work look at his mathematics and they just go, "Whew, I might take his word for it and believe the rest." But that's the basis of his mathematics. It's proportional relationships, harmonics, etc. The other thing which really blew my mind at that point, which is going to jump me through to this part of the talk, is he postulated that atomic bombs are not exploded in the way we're taught in high schools. Now, I was taught that atomic bombs are exploded as a result of the chance of little tiny particles hitting lots of other particles is increased from unlikely to definitely. And that involved throwing together two subcritical masses so that this likelihood was increased to definitely. But there's always the chance, however slim, that atomic bombs won't go off. There's always the chance, however slim, that atomic bombs might go off in stockpile if this is the true scenario. Bruce Cathy postulated very differently. He said that the nucleus of the atom is shattered by resonance, which is something that anyone researching Tesla will certainly feel resonance with. Resonance being the same sort of principle as how an opera singer can shatter a wine glass. The air resonates at a frequency to the wine glass and shatters. To achieve this resonance, Bruce Cathy maintained and proved mathematically to my satisfaction that you have to position the enriched core, you have to position the bomb at the right place at the right time. It meant time, meaning the relationship of the Earth and the Sun, place meaning a latitude and longitude. And he took all the bombs exploded in peace and wartime, this was at the late 70s, and he came up with the same mathematical relationships for those which had exploded. And there was no correlation with those that did not explode. So I was very excited by this, and being in high school, being right into 3-unit mathematics, my mind was filled with the implications of it, and it greatly excited me. It basically gave me my reason for existence. I was determined to get to the bottom of these claims and these allegations. The implications were, of course, that at the highest level there was no Cold War. Obviously the Russians and the Americans would know when these windows could open up for atomic explosions to occur, and you would be able to train fighters, bombers or missiles or interception equipment at these windows of space and time. And it may be in these days that they have perfected explosion techniques that means they don't have to wait to a window of space and time to do the explosions, but I think not. Looking at the last round of French tests and the Indian and Pakistan explosions, they are still maintaining the mathematical relationship, which indicates that they're still using resonance to shatter the atom. The implications that Russia and America were working together at the highest level, of course, in the 70s was heresy, especially in Australia. I just come from a few years before at primary school, the rumours swept through our little primary school in Tasmania. The communists are coming. They're going to take over the world and they're 10 years ahead of schedule. Now, Tasmania is at the bottom end of the world, but we were scared. I mean, this sort of propaganda goes to every corner of the world, and it changes the psyche of a lot of people. And when you're an impressionable young lad like myself, you sort of think, oh, communists. So I was determined to check this further. My life then took me from the community in Bellingen in northern New South Wales, which was like rainforest river, raw, chemical-free food, nice ladies coming and swimming naked in the river. I mean, it was paradise. I dragged myself away from paradise thinking, well, I've just got to get on with my life. So I went to Sydney. I started doing Sydney University science. My plan was to become a world-famous scientist, discover anti-gravity or something like that. And while I had their attention of the planet, I would jolly well tell them how to live and how to meditate and get everything right. After a year and a half of science at Sydney University, I'd had enough. They didn't even want to think about the things I wanted to think about. The students at the university, far from being the attractive, colourful people on the photographs of the 60s university people, this was the late 70s and early 80s, and that was about as conservative as you've ever seen in Australia. There was no long hair, no jeans, everyone looked like a bank teller. And it was thoroughly boring on all levels. I started doing volunteer work for a new age, sort of a neutral new age information centre in Sydney, which ran a very large alternative bookshop. And so I dropped out of university and moved full-time into this new age centre. We were, in the early 80s, this was when yoga, tai chi, meditation and health food was for the real weirdos. But we were promoting all aspects of this. I felt it was very important in life. My new goal was to give people choice of information so they can make up their own minds on what to eat, how to meditate, where to go and learn yoga, etc. So people came to our shop in droves. We started organising lecture tours, conferences. We brought out Swami this, we brought out Ram Dass, we brought out Kriyananda, Paul Solomon, Susie Holbesch, and a whole list of sort of new age names of the 70s. And I learned a lot. I learned a lot about people being one thing on stage and one thing off stage. And but I was determined that this was my course of action. Communication and information was where it was at. During my few years at this place called the New Awareness Centre, people started sending me conspiracy information. None dare call it conspiracy was out, and I was sent a copy of that. We had a colourful chap in Australia called Stan Deyo. Many people here heard of Stan Deyo? He wrote a book called The Cosmic Conspiracy, which was a bestseller in Australia, greatly influenced the psyche of a lot of people. And so I started thinking, all these conspiracies. People were accusing me of being part of a satanic plot because I was promoting information on meditation and acupuncture and colour therapy and crystals and God knows what they thought when channeling hit the streets. So I started finding myself being accused by radical Christians of being an agent of Satan, and I sort of stepped back to analyse this, because one likes to be popular, not be accused of being an agent of Satan. And so I had a good look around. I started researching more conspiracy information and became aware that a lot of things were not as they seemed. I'd also had personal experience in Tasmania. When my father had started speaking against chemical agriculture, he earned the wrath of quite a few powerful chemical companies in Tasmania. We used to regularly top dress our property, which is putting superphosphate on it, and the grass would get a rush. But when we stopped putting superphosphate on our property, the ground improved, the grass went into probably shock and trauma for about a year, and then it recovered, and all our calving problems, all our cattle problems, all our health problems totally disappeared upon just stopping the use of chemical agriculture. And if one wanted to go further, there are now so many agricultural supplements for your soil that you can go the other way and have extreme beneficial production of the soil. So I did some research. I ended up working for a glossy magazine called Simply Living magazine, which was a high quality glossy bi-monthly magazine dealing with human rights, environmental issues and alternative health. I was the person who was actually designed to sell advertising. I had already started up a free What's On magazine for the Sydney area called Southern Crossings, and in it everyone who was doing workshops, courses, talks, rallies, or had a health food shop was advertising in there. So I knew a lot of people. I started advertising sales for Simply Living magazine, and this is where my life really started getting very exciting. When one works at independent media organisations, you start to see lots of letters, lots of phone calls, lots of personal discussions with people who are trying to get their message to the general public through the mainstream media, but the mainstream media says, don't like that story. So we were getting people coming to our office who claimed they had cars running on water, people who claimed they were curing themselves of cancer using their urine or some herb or some vitamin or mineral or some new meditation technique. People were making claims and coming to us out of frustration that the mainstream media weren't picking up on it. Now, my boss, he was considered really weird. He was a nudist. He's now a parliamentarian in the state government of New South Wales. He was into float tanks. He started up Greenpeace Australia and put his money into lots of things. He was such a conservationist that one day in our yurt office, a yurt is like an octagonal building where you all cram into one space and feel really good about yourself because you're living in an environmentally sustainable dwelling. One day a courier truck did a U-turn on the paddock, on the field near our yurt in the middle of the forest north of Sydney. And the owner of the magazine rushed out and straightened up the grass between his fingers where the truck had gone. Oh boy. Sorry, I shouldn't say that. But one of the interesting parts of my life at that point was I became very interested in conspiracy theories. We had a chap in Australia called Peter Sawyer who was promoting a newsletter that he was publishing. This newsletter dealt with a growing new world order. It discussed the increasing amount of UN treaties which Australia was signatory to, which also affect you. We have treaties in place, not only in this country, but in Australia and New Zealand and Canada, which bind our country to rules and conditions that we're not even aware of. I'll give you one small example. The state of Western Australia decided in its wisdom to change slightly the educational curriculum for its students. Everyone agreed. Both sides of the Houses of Parliament were unanimous on this. It had public support. You wouldn't think anything could go wrong. Even the kids would benefit from this change in education. But no, after this had been agreed on and passed through the state parliament, some United Nations bureaucrat somewhere decided, no, this contravenes UN treaty number blah, 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 which is protection for the rights of the child. And everyone in Australia was like horrified. And in Western Australia, basically it meant that the elected officials, the elected government was not allowed to go ahead with that decision. So we had instantly in the early 80s examples of how you can think you have an elected government which is running your place, but it isn't. How much time have I got left?
22 minutes.
Okay, gee. Now, while I was at Simply Living magazine, as I said, I was getting into conspiracy theory research in a major way. One of the allegations by this chap, Peter Sawyer, was that, and he was an ex-public servant, so he came from inside the system, and he was high profile at that point in time because he was detailing what he called bungling and incompetence in the bureaucracy. And that was the slant of his newsletter for the first few issues. However, upon receiving later information, he changed that position of the bureaucracy is bungling and incompetent to, no, these people are intelligent. They're selected for their job in the public service because of their qualifications and their expertise. They're not knowingly making mistakes. They're working to an agenda. And as soon as one switches to that train of thinking, you start to see patterns. You start to see the same executive level public servants appearing in the same decisions to okay this treaty or to ratify this or to make this change in one part of our society. So he started crying conspiracy, and as soon as he did, the floodgates opened. A lot of disgruntled insiders within the government and government services started slipping him information. He started making public details about a secret government building in Canberra, which housed all the big computers for all the government departments and was linked up to Pine Gap, linked up to the NSA. It was called the Deakin Centre, and it was a real eye-opener in terms of my part of the experience. I was sitting on the fence, but when I got involved in the Deakin Centre fiasco, I realised that this is all true. I actually went to the Deakin Centre. I got permission to go in there with a photographer using sort of the guise that I was a journalist for Simply Living magazine. There is a big building there. It does have reinforced thick concrete walls. The staff are trained to survive a public uprising and a public assault on the building. There is a huge underground section which is about 1 metre away from the well-known CIA underground headquarters, which is under a phone installation. I mean, it's just like Doctor Who. You walk into this tiny building and it's obvious that there's a huge underground section. I sat in the car park outside the Deakin Centre watching some very well-decorated generals and people in uniform going into this tiny telephone exchange and not coming out. And I was looking at the size of the building and the number of people, and I'm thinking, wait a minute, you don't have to be an Einstein to work this out. But the thing was, only about 2 of our politicians knew of this building, which surprised me. So I suspect you have in this country and in Great Britain and as well as in Australia. The real people in power to watch, the real people that you should be keeping a close eye on are the public servants, the people who stay in power, in office, despite changes of elected officials above them. Keep an eye on them. They're the ones with the real power. The ones that cop the flack or get the credit temporarily are the politicians, but they are very kept in the dark. Anyone here ever see a show come out of Britain called Yes Minister or Yes Prime Minister? Oh. One of my favourite TV shows. It basically shows that the real power in a government of a country lies with the public service and not with the elected officials. So, back to the next interesting part. Some of you here may have heard rumours of that I'm a Libyan agent. So this is a good time to explain. You may hear about this. You may. I mean, in England, I've been written up in the centre of the New Statesman as a neo-Nazi, right-wing, anti-Jewish extremist who's funded by Colonel Gaddafi. Do I look like that? What happened was this. I was starting to rub shoulders with conspiracy theorists and get a bit paranoid at night and thinking about locking my car in my house and listening to strange noises and thinking, oh, should I do something about it? Like McMaster was saying last night. And one day somebody said to me, you know, Colonel Gaddafi's into conspiracy theories. And like Colonel Gaddafi was like the Antichrist in Australia. I mean, you know, we kicked out his ambassador. The Americans had told us that, you know, he was Satan in disguise and that we should not have anything to do with him or his friends, and we should let the Americans come in with their warships and change the nature of power in the South Pacific, because South Pacific was falling under Libya's influence. Man, I'll tell you what. So I started hearing these things about Colonel Gaddafi, and I'm thinking, well, you know, that could explain why America and Britain really hate him. And so it wasn't long before the only representative for the Libyans in Australia, which was a little private group in Melbourne called the Libyan Arab Cultural Centre. And there was a guy down there called Robert Pash who was sort of running this organisation. And Robert Pash came to our office in Manly for Simply Living magazine one day and said to the publisher and the editor, hey, there's this big conference happening in Libya. Do you want to go over? All expenses paid. We've got tickets for 2. And, you know, so the editor and the publisher of the magazine went over, and they came back and they used their trip and their information to make a big cover issue of Simply Living magazine, and it sort of sold pretty well. But I asked the editor and publisher, all these questions about what they saw, their impressions, and things like that, and I was hooked. And one day I managed to actually get this Libyan Arab Cultural Centre guy, Robert Pash, into my office and have a chat to him and said, look, I'm not into conspiracy theories too, what can you tell me about Gaddafi and conspiracy theories? And Robert just rolled his eyes and go, oh man, where do I start? And he started sending me out boxes of books and files and transcripts of speeches, not only from within Libya, but from observers of Libya from within Western society. And I realised, boy, the New World Order has a lot to fear from countries like Libya. I say like Libya in the sense that if you are a nation on this planet today who wants to be self-sufficient and independent, economically, trade-wise, intelligence or militarily, you are taboo. You are a no-no country. North Korea and Libya are probably the only two countries that I know of that maintain publicly that they want to cut loose from this interdependence that the rest of the world is heading towards. They want to issue their own currencies, they want to be in control of their own countries, they don't want to be signatories to the United Nations treaties. And isn't it interesting, North Korea and Libya are the two most maligned, evil, satanic countries on the entire planet, and that's their crime. The rest of it is mainly propaganda. I'm not coming out on the side of Libya in terms of condoning terrorist activities that they did undertake in the 70s in terms of financing elements of the IRA, but I would like to say that my own interviews and research in Libya indicates that once they realised that terrorism was not in the world favour, they backed away from it, as did most of the other Arab terrorists. The goal of terrorism initially being to attract media attention to your cause, not just to kill people, to attract media attention. And I met some of the famous terrorists. I met Layla Khalid, who'd nice, attractive lady who I was chatting up, turned out to be a terrorist in the hotel foyer in Libya. I got over there 3 times in all expenses paid, courtesy of Libyan intelligence, it turned out. The Libyans at that stage had been cut off from the planet, and they were just super keen to get anybody over who would listen to their point of view and mingle with other people who were open-minded. So I was attending conferences over there. I went over a total of 3 times. And I met lots of interesting people from all over the world, heads of state from African countries, and I certainly came back with a very different picture of the planet. One thing I noticed was speaking to people from Southeast Asian countries, speaking to people from African countries, they had a very different view of the planet than we had in Australia. They certainly had a different view of the planet than people in America or even Europe had. For example, sitting in airport lounges in Europe, when I'm sort of sitting next to a traveller and they say, oh, where are you going? I say, I'm going to Libya. No one blinks twice. No one had any problem with it at all. Say it in a lounge room in America, you'd probably be locked up. Saying it in the airport lounge in Australia, it was like, whoa, don't want to be on the same plane as this guy. It's very interesting to see how perceptions vary. Oh man, I've got so much to tell you guys, I don't know where to start. So that's how I got to Libya. So I'm not a Libyan agent. I support their right to choose them to run the country the way they want. Incidentally, just so you are aware, Libya is not a dictatorship. Colonel Gaddafi does not maintain law and order with guns and troops, etc. I was in Karachi one day en route from Europe back to Australia. We got off an aeroplane. Anywhere you go in Karachi, in many other countries, you see people with automatic weapons on street corners basically maintaining law and order. None of this in Libya. I sat in on a parliamentary meeting in Libya on my first visit where Gaddafi had proposed abolishing the death penalty. This is something he does every year, and every year the people take a vote on it. And it's a very interesting system. It's probably more of a democracy than Australia or the US has. That question is taken right down to the average villager in the desert, and they all vote on whether or not they want to get rid of the death penalty, keep the death penalty, or modify it. One thing I learned over there was that the Arabs actually consider imprisonment to be worse than death. They would rather die than be locked up in jail. So that was some very interesting debating going on. Needless to say, I saw many cases where the people overthrew a recommendation or a requirement by Colonel Gaddafi. He is not a dictator. He's not totally in power. In fact, the power structure of most Middle East countries, you should be aware, is tribal, family. You don't have individuals, you have a family who has their main man in power. In Iraq, in Kuwait, Kuwait's an interesting case, many of you probably know this, when the oil wealthy nations like America, France, Holland and Britain came to the region, when they discovered oil and gas and raw materials, they basically took the locals and turfed them out and put in a tribe that would do what they wanted. They usually picked a small tribe, usually despised by the others, and they would prop this tribe up with weapons, training, money, finance, and they would be in control of the country. That's how the El Sabah family are in control of Kuwait. Pretty much the same in Saudi Arabia and I suspect many other countries. It makes for some very interesting dynamics in Arab relations. It will keep the Arabs disunited for a long time while that tactic is employed. Okay, I want to give you a bit of a snapshot. Well, actually, I'll backtrack. After I worked at Simple Living magazine, I gained a lot more contacts, a lot more experience and ideas. I started working for an environmental charity where we were going to raise millions of dollars with all these big bands, a bit like a Band-Aid or a Live Aid for the environment in Australia. And by a strange quirk of fate, I ended up taking over Nexus magazine in about 1990. The magazine had been in existence for about 3 years. Before that, it was a typical Australian sort of new age, alternative health magazine, with the exception it covered a bit of stuff on UFOs and it covered a bit of stuff on conspiracies, and that made it out on a limb, pretty weird. So when I took it over, I dropped a lot of the existing material out and kept it down to my favourite subjects. And when I took over the magazine, I honestly thought that there were so few people interested in that sort of material that I would maybe make enough money selling the magazine to pay the rent on the house, and it would be like a self-paying hobby. And my favourite subjects are pretty much what you see in the magazine today. Someone asked me yesterday, do I believe in the articles I publish? And I've got to say to you, yes, I do. I select those articles very carefully. I might not believe in every conclusion that each writer might draw, but I think it's important in most cases that you consider the information that a writer might base his conclusion upon, so you can make your own conclusions. I look at it all like putting together a big jigsaw puzzle, something I was always keen on when I was a kid and still am today. Each article in the magazine could be considered a piece of a jigsaw puzzle, but it's not so much the article itself which is the key piece, it's components within the article. And I strongly encourage people to take components out of any article and use it and try and dovetail it with components of another article, because there is a lot of uniformity in what we publish. Now, I've really been put on the spot because I had lots of interesting rave material to go into. Now you want to hear all the stuff I'm not allowed to publish. Okay. A lot of people ask me, do we get heavied and hassled about what we publish in the magazine? We have had some problems. And I feel in some times I have walked a very fine line between having an accident and not having an accident. I'll give you some examples of minor problems we've had. When we first opened up the magazine in the United Kingdom, I selected a newspaper printer that was very high profile for printing interesting and informative, mainly left-wing publications. I figured these people would be braver than the pack in England. And I sent the magazine to them. They looked at the magazine. They were very excited. Dollar signs went off in their eyes. They said, this is how much we'll print the magazine for you. We'd be delighted to do it. So we had an extended working relationship in place with this printer in England. I sent them the money in advance, put it into their bank account. They printed that particular issue of the magazine, covers and inside. And then they were told by the chairman and the board of directors of their company that they were not allowed to continue their relationship with Nexus magazine. And to this day, I don't know why. And the executive officers I dealt with were totally embarrassed about it all. So I had to go and find another printer, which I did pretty quickly, and I found a printer about 2/3 of the price too. So it worked out okay. But I perceived that, if anything, some of my enemies may be coming from a different part of the political spectrum than I thought. We have had a couple of cases where we've printed an issue of the magazine and we've put it on a courier or on a bus to go to the printer in Australia, and half the package arrives sealed, but another part of it is missing. And I tell you, it's like something out of the Twilight Zone. Somewhere on a 3-hour bus trip, somebody went into the boot of that bus and they opened up our package of one particular issue of Nexus magazine. They took out all the body copy, and they just left the cover in there. And I've got 3 people who all saw us put it in and seal it, including the printer's representative. So that's a total mystery. The subjects which I know are sensitive for me to publish, well, maybe this applies more in the early 90s. In the early 90s, I announced in one particular issue that I was going to print a series of articles which proved that the powder drug trade was dominated, run and controlled by the intelligence community. It was my impression at that stage that the mafia were actually a second level down in this. The intelligence community I perceived from my own research, my own contacts and my own experience to be in control of the powder drug trade. Now when I say the intelligence community, I'm talking about sections of the intelligence community in Canada, New Zealand, Australia, Britain and America. That's countries I had proof of. And so we announced we were going to be running a 1 or 2 part series. And I was basically told indirectly by British intelligence that they did not want this out there. They did not want this on the front cover of a magazine on every newsstand in Australia. That was their logic. And I was particularly intrigued by this because at this point in time, Bo Gritz's visit to the Golden Triangle had been aired on radio and was being copied and circulated around conspiracy theorists and right-wing extremists in America. So a lot of people in America were aware of the CIA and the drug thing. Mel Gibson movie, I think, had been out, Air America. I mean, it was not new to consider the CIA involved in the powder drug trade, but still, they didn't want it on the front cover of a magazine. They didn't mind audio tapes, videotapes, or books. People, not everybody reads those, but everybody walks into a newsagent. I found that particularly interesting. I also found it interesting how they communicated that information to me. They didn't just ring me up and say, "Hi, this is British intelligence, blah, blah, blah." They used people that I knew, and they gave them information that when they talked to me that I would know they were serious. One of them was particularly fascinating. There was one chap driving a taxi in Brisbane, which is the nearest city to where I live. He had dropped off a fare and driven a couple of blocks. This fare jumped into his cab and started talking to the driver. This guy said, "You know Duncan Rhodes from Nexus magazine, don't you? I want you to give him a message. I want you to tell him not to continue publishing these drug articles." And the guy was really freaked out. The guy was really freaked out because this guy had jumped in knowing where his cab would be. He was thinking, I'm driving randomly around the city, but someone knew where he was. Opens all sorts of weird and wonderful things. So the other area you may have probably read from any editorials that you read in Nexus, the other area of sensitivity, the only real area I haven't got into, which I know would be really dangerous, is, and it's a really sad area, it's the area of the link between the intelligence community at the higher levels and the satanic human sacrifice ritual magic groups. I'm not talking about people who practice, you know, a little black and white magic. I'm talking about people who do really horrible and icky things to other people, mainly young innocents. And I must say I was in denial of that whole sort of thing for a long time. I just refused to believe that magic could exist independently of reality like that. And I have to confess that I have changed my belief systems about that. I've spoken to intelligence officials who have been witness to seeing things like a group of high-ranking British aristocracy involving intelligence leaders of several nations standing in a circle around a statue in front of a very wealthy mansion after midnight, muttering a few prayers, all dressed up, and he saw this statue come to life. And the guy cried when he told me. He said he involuntarily shat himself at the time. This guy was an assassin and had been involved in more shootouts, including some in Australia, than you ever see in a James Bond movie, and he proved it to me. I mean, he had proof for everything he said. And when he told me that, I realised with a chill that there is reality to this whole thing. There is magic exists, and there is a form of accessing that power which is not very pleasant, and it involves pain and suffering. And they use the energy generated by that. I know that if I published articles on that sort of subject, naming names and people, I would get in trouble. If I named any specific names of Australians in a derogatory or slanderous way, I would be closed down tomorrow. I seem to be able to name Americans for being downright dirty drug dealers and what have you without being sued or stomped on. I've we've regularly named Clinton, Bush and many other people as being involved and actively involved in the powder drug trade, and I'm sure it's no news to you people. And so that sort of material is stuff I cannot publish. There's nothing on the UFO front that I feel that we can't publish or that there are secrets that should be withheld. In fact, I feel the opposite is in effect. I feel at the moment that the powers that be are putting into effect a acclimation program, as Richard Boylan calls it, where they're releasing information to the public at a very fast rate. And if anything, I feel I'm encouraged to put out UFO-type information. I don't repeat blindly everything you read in all the UFO magazines, mainly because that's their field of expertise. I select interesting items from that field and put them there for a reason. And so I'll have to let you to determine what little piece in each article is the key thing for why I've published it. Now, what, 1 minute? That's it. 1 minute, okay. I have a lot of notes here. No. You have to give everyone a fair go. Okay. My summary here. The main reason I do Nexus magazine, apart from getting a real kick out of it, apart from being an infomaniac, I am totally addicted to the information flow. I read lots of magazines, newsletters. I surf the internet for hours. I'm fortunate to be able to work at home. We have a garden shed, which we sealed up a couple of years ago. We were starting to make a little bit of money, and I was able to buy an air conditioner which heated us during the winter and cooled us during summer. And I was able to seal the inside of the shed so the snakes and the wildlife wouldn't get in. And so we work from home. I forgot what I was going to say. Right, well, the reason I do Nexus magazine. Apart from being addicted to the information and the enjoyment of it, I really feel that our planet, as you know, is entering an amazing period of growth and expansion. I really feel that things are going to change dramatically. What we hold as dear and important to us now is going to be totally changed. So I encourage you all to adopt and explore new belief systems. As soon as you settle on something which you think explains reality, hold it in limbo and reanalyze it, compare it around, because the more you can change what you think is real, the more you're going to be able to survive. The bottom line of our magazine is empowerment. I am a strong advocate of self-empowerment. I think power to the people was one of the greatest slogans that ever came out. I think that giving power to people, encouraging people to take back their power is it. And one of the things I like to do in Nexus magazine, I'm a fan of Monty Python, I like to shock. One of the things I like to do, and I see it happening a lot in Britain, I guess, is I like to use the magazine articles to shock people out of being latched into their reality paradigm, to shock them into considering new and other views on life, the universe and everything. So empowerment is it. So I thank you all for listening and for reading the magazine. We've had lots of people come up and give us wonderful notes of support and what have you. And thank you for being a wonderful audience.